All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome online and in person to this panel, War and Tech, What if Tech for Good became Tech for Peace? Now, my name is Théo Bourgeois-Rigonce. I'm a journalist at Euractiv, and I have the extreme honor of presenting and moderating this panel for the next 45 minutes. Now, when we think about tech and war, and when we put the two words together in one same sentence, it's a pretty daunting prospect to think that we'll be talking about it for just about 45 minutes, when in fact it requires a few PhDs. So for the purpose of this conversation, we'll try to keep things practical, down to earth, and very grounded. Now, essentially the goal of this conversation is to look and decipher what tech solutions exist out there to help us make the world a better, a more livable, and a more cohesive space. The war in Ukraine will be our starting point today, and we'll be looking to, I'll ask my panelists to share examples of concrete tech solutions that exist out there to protect Ukrainians from Russian shelling, to fight the Russian aggression online, but also to give Ukrainians hope when, having migrated to another EU country, including in France, they need to make a living and they need to integrate, and we'll see how tech can help foster that. But war obviously isn't just about the front lines, it's much bigger than this. And economic, energy, health, ecological crises beg the question of what tech can do to serve as a lever of empowerment and become a true catalyst for peace. And we have 45 minutes only. Now, with me on this panel are four excellent speakers to discuss the matter. Jean Guo, you're CEO of Connexio, which is a training platform that looks to provide vulnerable people with necessary tech skills to enter the labor force. Jean-Noël Barrot, you're a minister for the French Minister for Digital Transformation and Telcos. We have Benoît Tabaka, who's the SG at Google France. And last but not least, Nathalie Veremeva. You're the director of Tech Ukraine, a platform supporting and showcases Ukraine tech ecosystem. And I'd like to start the conversation with you. Can you give us a sense or the extent to which war today is being waged online in Ukraine, be it through disinformation campaigns or the creation of an internet army, and what cyber tools are out there and exist to fight that fight online?
Thank you for the question, and indeed I'm happy to be here and to share our experience, because since the war in Ukraine started, tech received quite a big stress test and became one of the pillars of Ukrainian resistance in multiple ways, be it donations, be it international connections and understanding of how international dialogue works, exact solutions, physical people that were joining the IT army and the internet armies of Ukraine. And generally, yes, I would say that I think this conflict is one of the first hybrid conflicts in which online and cybersecurity is playing a very important role. And both from the Russian side and also from our side, of course, we have cyber armies. I don't know that much about Russians, and they were not succeeding that much, though of course they were attacking us, especially at the beginning, and trying to get down the critical infrastructure. They didn't succeed in that, and our banking system, that was one of the most important things, still kept strong. We did the same, and we did more. So there were a lot of volunteers in our tech companies, and tech sector was booming over the last years, like really much. We had around 5,000 IT companies, more than almost 300,000 tech professionals. So we were doing quite well, and we were growing 30% per year. So that was quite good. So we were established and ready for this. So when the conflict started, there are two armies were created: the Internet Army and the IT Army. So the Internet Army was the one working with disinformation and just with the narratives, with the social media, etc. And IT Army was the one that was focused on cyber attacks. So we were attacking the Kremlin resources, especially the ones that were sharing the propaganda, because that actually was, in our opinion, one of the sources of conflict, because they actually were influencing not only their population and investing billions of dollars there, but also they were trying to influence Ukrainian population, and I know that they are doing also this with other countries, so there is a big question how we're going to protect our information space against those influences that are being posed by not friendly countries or people or organizations. So we just took these resources down. We just had successful attacks on the banking system. We took some other critical resources. So really, there are numerous ones. I don't know exactly what kind of, and I don't think that there are some concrete organizations. There are a lot of different volunteers. I know that 95% of IT companies have one or more IT professionals that are being involved into these types of activities. Eventually, our Ministry of Digital Transformation took the lead and also helped to organize these groups because, you know, the specifics of Ukrainian society is that it's very much peer-to-peer. So when the challenge started, it is not only the government that took this challenge to organize everything. These are the people that were really responding. Everybody was thinking, okay, what can we do? And tech companies did the same. Another thing, how it was really helpful is the homework that was done by the government, that is the DIA application. The public services, because our president, our current president Zelensky, won the elections with the slogan, "The country in the smartphone." And that was very wise, because it is exactly because of this that the state managed to keep the dialogue with its citizens despite everything. So we have there, of course, we have the digitalized documents, but we also have there the applications for applying for internally displaced persons to receive the compensation. We have there the applications for voting for different critical questions. We have there the application Yevorok, which is used to identify the enemies. So actually all the population is being involved in finding the occupant, the aggressor. And so much more, really. You can apply there to get the compensation for the destroyed property or whatever. So, and this application helped to 50% of Ukrainians already using it, and that's already a big number. And that helped to maintain this dialogue despite all the turbulences and despite all the challenges that was caused by the war. And that actually also helped Ukraine to really cope organizationally with all these problems that, of course, war is creating. And we lay a lot of hope to the development of tech. We do have quite a number of challenges that currently need to be solved by startups, by tech companies. And we're really hopeful that by development of our sector and by building connections with other countries and especially with technologically advanced countries, we can actually do better together, sharing the same values.
Thank you, Natalie. Moving on to Benoit, I mean, in the context of the war in Ukraine, Google has taken radical steps, especially when it comes to, for example, removing specific locations to protect local Ukrainian populations. What can tech do to protect civilians, to further protect civilians in Ukraine today?
No, thanks a lot for the question. And clearly, what happened in Ukraine is more or less a second tech crisis that we have to face, because the first one was the COVID, when technology was used more or less to continue to all the activities. You spend years, almost 2 years in front of a computer, just having drinks with friends, making business, running a government, or just enjoying some new experiences. So it's clear that what happened in Ukraine is totally different, but I remember when the invasion started, I was in Washington, D.C., more exactly at the residence of the French ambassador in the US, and we saw on the TV the invasion. And immediately, because I was one of the few Europeans based in the US at that time, I was onboarded into the team working on what Google can do and should do in front of this totally new situation, because it was the first time that we have seen such invasion of European country happening. Few things. The first one is what we can do on the ground, and specifically regarding like Ukrainian. As you said, like the first point that we have to deal with was some features that were existing on Google, and specifically on Google Maps. For example, when you are really using Google Maps today, you have the traffic, so you can see if there is like a lot of people on the road, or you can see if like a location is specific busy, like you want to enter a restaurant, say, oh, it's busy, I will come later. We decided to disable this kind of features because, of course, we were giving like some information, sensitive information, potentially to the Russian army, meaning to target some roads, seeing like a lot of people, traffic jams, or a lot of people trying to escape the war, or for example, to show a specific location where a lot of people, refugees, were located. So that's why we had to think differently about some feature view to help people that could be dangerous and harmful for people. So we decided, for example, for this kind of specific feature to disable. A second point is we work with the government, the Ukrainian government, to deploy on smartphones some alerts. It was called the air raid alerts, meaning with the ability to notify Ukrainian in the country where we had like plane coming or bomb coming on the country, and just to be sure that people could be aware. Of course, when you are like in a bombshell, when you are like, I would say in the middle of nowhere, you are not the ability to watch TV, to listen radio, or to receive any news. Having this kind of alert coming on your smartphone was the best way to communicate to the end users in Ukraine. And then what we deploy also for Ukrainian outside of the country was the idea how we can help them. So we deploy like with the support of the Ukrainian government many solutions in terms of education, in terms of giving people like the ability to continue, I would say like to do their job or to educate. And the last point in terms of features, very interesting, was to accelerate Google Translate. A lot of Ukrainians were outside of Ukraine, engaging with Polish people, with French people, with Spanish people, and so on. And we had to put between the end of them, this kind of translation. But on the top of that, we had also to secure on 3 points. First one, it was the first time that we had a cyber war, a real cyber war, meaning that a lot of attacks. So we work with several websites, including the government website, to protect them, and to put them in our infrastructure with a sort of Project Shield. It's like a protection of the website against like cyber attacks. Two, we have seen a lot of attacks targeting many people involved in the war, meaning not only like Ukrainian officials, but also French officials, journalists, military, and so on, trying to hack their Gmail account. So we deploy like many resources to protect and to alert people that they are subject to several attacks. And the third one, but we can talk later, was about all this kind of new way of cyber war, meaning disinformation. We have to fight against a huge amount of content. Meaning like fake news, a lot of propaganda coming from like Russian channel. We know the famous RT story, but also a lot of people spreading fake news, more or less using the Russian propaganda and spreading like online. Not only on video, it was like we have seen like many news publishers or so-called news publishers that we have to tackle with. And when we look back to what happened, it was like a real flow of fake news information relative to what happened like during the invasion. And clearly, it was a new threat that we did not see before. And we have to put in place new resources, new tools, new detection, to put in place new processes, meaning that to tackle such kind of stuff. But we can talk about it later.
And we'll come back to that when we start thinking about tech for peace more generally. But for the time being, Jean, I want to turn to you because in a sense you're kind of on the receiving end, shall I say, of the war in Ukraine because you're there giving opportunities to Ukrainian people to have fled the country and have gone to other EU countries, including France. I mean, my question to you is, how do you see tech to be a glue or a vector in bringing people together as a way to serve and as a way to support those most in need, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Ukrainians that have arrived in France?
No, so thank you for the question. And I think at Connexio, we always think about the question of there needs to be technological innovation, but we want to make sure that this can benefit the most people, including the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. So I think if you look at it, instances all around the world, we've seen that tech has played a very key role in peacekeeping efforts. For example, after the elections in Kenya and the violence that happened there, an application called Ushahidi was launched in order to help report incidents to keep accountability and transparency when it came to democratic elections. When you look at instances in India where there was the Safe City, which was a crowd-sourced application to allow women to report incidents of sexual violence, to help identify trends, and we see the increasing power of tools, including AI, to help sift through this data and make these much more reliable and relevant. So when you look at, what were the efforts that have been done in Ukraine, there's a few concrete examples we've seen, and some of them we've actually been in dialogue directly with partners there to work on. One, I think, is, there's still a critical question of infrastructure and connectivity. So there have been different initiatives to make sure that, for schools, for hospitals, for public administration, there's still computers, laptop for Ukraine, for example, amongst the different initiatives, the critical media hub to make sure that people are still able to access and be able to connect. I think the second example is there is, at the Digital Assembly by the European Commission, they launched a consortium called the Future EM Community, which really tries to bring in different stakeholders to think about best practices, how do we continue to share information, combat disinformation, and other stakeholder initiatives. And finally, regarding the reskilling, I think that's something that we've been really interested in, given our expertise at Connexio on fighting the digital divide, making sure that people can successfully and professionally integrate into society. We've been actually working with partners to see, for those refugees who come here, how do we help them reskill into a new environment, knowing that maybe regarding the language and the skills, it's not necessarily their home country. And so there have been different boot camps on the Ukraine side, include IT Start, some of that we dialogue with, to figure out how can we bring something also here in France to continue to do training, but also different workshops. And so we've received some support from different partners to continue those efforts on the other side here in France.
Great, thank you ever so much. And Minister, now on to you. I mean, you've heard such a great number of concrete examples as to how tech is used on a daily basis in Ukraine when it comes to fighting a war, protecting civilians, but also giving the necessary tools for those most in need. Can you give us a sense of what the French government is doing, both in France but also at the European level, to help these tech solutions grow and develop? And how do you see tech for peace developing in this context?
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I see the sort of a role for tech both in preventing war, before war, during the war, and after the war for rebuild. In preventing war, I think the most important and novel dimension that the aggression of Russia on Ukraine has brought us to become aware about is the role of disinformation. And I think there is an increasing awareness that those public spaces that we've created, that have opened a number of opportunities for communications and sharing of ideas and contacts and so on, need to take into account the fact that enemies of freedom, enemies of peace, are using disinformation to prepare for war. We've seen this at the European level early on, and we've taken decisions that had never been taken before to forbid channels that were supported by Russians and that were broadcasting Russian propaganda. I'm thinking about Russia Today and Sputnik. And then we've kept tracking them as they were still being broadcast through websites in remote areas of the world. And this is very important because we've seen lately in Africa how Russia has used these kind of tools of disinformation in order to stimulate violence and weaken democracy and institutions. So I think the key challenge is, of course, not only to react to this kind of sort of new destabilizing tools that rogue states or enemies of peace and democracy are using, but also to make social networks and platforms more responsible. And we've just adopted a major regulation at the European level, which is called the Digital Services Act, whereby the largest social network platforms will have the obligation to take into account the risk that disinformation throughout that platform could cause to democracy. The new obligations have come into action, and we have a European MP who is in the room, and I know there were a number of them just earlier on. Marie-Pierre, who's a friend. Our responsibility will be to follow the enactment and the application of these new obligations that came into force last week. Now, during the war, there are two things that struck me during the war in Ukraine. Is one, the necessity and urgency to provide Ukraine with access to communications, data, and cyber. Communications, because one of the first thing that an aggressor will do in a country as Ukraine is to isolate the country from global communications. And here there's been a lot that's been done both by the US and European countries to reconnect or help Ukrainian people reconnect, both for civil purposes but also military purposes. I'm thinking of data as well, because providers of cloud, both from the US and Europe, has offered possibilities to Ukrainian people to safeguard their data. And I'm thinking cyber, because here again there's been a coordinated effort to support the IT army that Natalie was talking about earlier. But the second aspect of how tech can help during war is, of course, the support to refugees. We would not have been able in Europe to welcome so many Ukrainian refugees if it were not for tech, the ability to help them find housing, to help them find transportation, to help them find reskilling, training, and jobs, to help them access basic communications as well. We've seen a number of telco operators providing free access to telecommunications in the countries where Ukrainian refugees were landing, because if you can't connect to telecommunications, when you're a refugee, you don't have money to start with, then you're lost and you're cut from your family that is back in your country. And then after the war, when the time for rebuilding comes, then of course there is room for investment in tech, especially when you look at France and Europe on the one hand, and Ukraine on the other hand, because France and Ukraine are both technological countries, and there is a lot we can mutually learn from each other. We can learn a lot from Ukraine, because Ukraine has a vibrant tech and entrepreneurial scene on the one hand, and Ukraine is more advanced than France in terms of digital access to public services. There is one application that I think you mentioned that is called DIA, through which the Ukrainian people can access many of the public services in an easy way. And this is not something that we have today in France, and I think there is a lot we can learn on this end.
Brilliant. Thank you, Minister. Actually, before turning to Natalie, Benoit, I'd like your take on the Digital Services Act, which is DSA, an acronym that we've heard a lot about. Can you perhaps put that in context in the question of disinformation, especially in Ukraine? And more broadly, I mean, what role can big tech players such as Google and the other GAFAMs, what is the role that they can play in bringing tech for peace about? And how do we get to them meeting that role?
I think to the question about what is the role of the big tech, the answer is quite easy. We have a big role to play. And what the minister said about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is totally true, meaning that during many years, and it was in parallel of the Ukraine war, so it was quite interesting to have the discussion in parallel of living such kind of issues at the same time to design what could be the best regulation. What we have seen during the Ukraine situation, or ahead of the Ukraine invasion, and also during the Ukraine war, what we have seen, like a huge amount of content was like videos, images, it was like text, and so on, published like in a different way. It was like a real operation of foreign interference, trying to influence the situation in many countries, and also to shift the position of citizens towards Ukraine. We have seen also like a sort of escalation. We have seen some tension. Perhaps you remember a situation in Sweden where young people were just totally scared about potential invasion of Sweden by Russia, and it was following like many videos they have seen like on a social network, and so on and so on. So it's clear that right now the several platforms are a critical role to play in terms of protecting people. In order also like to be sure that we can deliver the right information to people, and also to prevent people to be exposed to this kind of foreign interference. So it's clear that that's more or less the goal of the DSA. The DSA wants to be sure that the several platforms are not only removing content, but more importantly are taking proactive measures in order to prevent that European citizens, French citizens will be exposed to harmful content. So that's more or less the goal. So what it means, for example, for us in terms of what happened in Ukraine. I remember exactly what happened. The Sunday after the invasion, I had a phone call with the French minister during the night. By 10 p.m., we have also like discussion between the French minister and several execs at Google. Then we had like mini discussion. I remember also that France took the initiative for the first time to have a European discussion between all tech ministers and executives for tech company to have a blunt, honestly, I was in the room, but a blunt discussion about, okay, how we can tackle misinformation online and how we can improve the DSA in order to tackle this kind of misinformation. What we have to do today in terms of platforms. The first one, we have to put in place the right people in terms of moderation. We need to analyze content. We need to be sure that we can take action on content. We have, of course, to remove content, illegal content, or content violating our policies quite quickly. We are removing, I think, on YouTube, if I'm thinking about YouTube, like between 6 and 9 million videos every quarter. But on the top of that, we need to be sure that we are updating on a regular basis and permanently our several policies to address the new issues that could pop up. For example, when we had the Ukrainian situation, we modify our policies, I don't know how many times. Because each time we fix something, we have seen the Russians doing like a new practice. So permanently we have this kind of, to address this kind of stuff, and it should be something made not only by one platform, but by all platforms. Because it's something that the minister said. When we had to tackle Russia Today, we cut Russia Today on YouTube, we cut Sputnik on YouTube, then we have seen like copy-paste of those channels appearing on YouTube. I think that we removed, based on the EC decision, something like 80,000 channels on YouTube, just like copy-paste of Russian-supported channels. Then we have seen, I think it was like late last year, I think, or at the beginning of this year, Russia Today coming through like another website called Odysseys, and we following the notification of the minister, we remove the content from search and so on and so on. So it's a permanent battle. So we need to react. And the key thing that's all for the DSA is, for the first time, we have a true channel of communication and a clear channel of communication with regulators, both at the European and the national level, with also government, to be sure that we can have a dialogue, a permanent dialogue. It's not only like having on one side official and on the other side the tech company. Right now, we have to sit all together, to meet all together on a regular basis, and clearly, it's improving the work we are making, meaning that we have seen that during the riots in France. We are in touch with the minister and his team on a regular basis. We are in touch with the police on a regular basis to be sure that we were able to engage to address the several issues. And we are doing the same also in other kind of situations. For example, some fires that we had in the south of France and so on and so on. So for me, the role of the big tech now is clearly to be part of the response. We are part of the response. We need to invest more in terms of technology, in terms of resources, but also we cannot do that alone. We have to do that with the officials, regulators and governments, but also we have to do that with the several NGOs, meaning that when it comes to finding like new solutions to tackle the new kind of issues, I'm going like beyond the pure Ukraine crisis, but if we are thinking about climate change, if we are thinking about digital inclusion, etc., we can play a role, we can have some ideas, we can have some resources, we can have some funding, but that's why we are working with several NGOs and looking at GN. But because we know that we have better people structure that can tackle this kind of stuff. You have the ideas. You have like the right way to address the issues. Sometimes you are just missing money and technical support, and that's where tech company, and is the case with our charity branch called Google.org, is playing a role, meaning that also to support NGOs that could help to address the several issues.
Thank you, Benoit. And Natalie, I mean, if we're going to take a bit of a more macro perspective and take a step back, how do you think technology ought to be used to, to create a more humanistic world? I think that's how you put it when we discussed it backstage, and battle the multiple crises that we're facing, not just obviously the war in Ukraine, but also ecological crisis, health, energy, economy. What is the role of tech here?
I believe that currently what we are facing and what we're undergoing is as big as the huge revolution. So the first revolution was the agricultural revolution, when we stopped gathering and started doing the agriculture. Then there was the industrial revolution, when we did this mass production. Now we are experiencing, and since we're in the middle of it, we are not fully aware of all the massive shifts that we are undergoing. And this is shifts in the amount of information, the shifts in connectivity, in communication, in ability just to perceive the world as a closer place, and also an unprecedented ecological challenges, because, for example, if you take industrial fishing or some other mass production that is actually influencing the oceans and influencing the soils, etc. So this is really we are making the changes to the earth and also to our society that we can't still estimate and understand ourselves. And I think that generally speaking about the role of tech can, of course, it creates some threats that we are dealing with, but it also creates the opportunities to go to the next level. And with these opportunities, I would say that the first and basic level, and this is also really very much connects to the previous dialogue, is the perception of the information by the people. So now, with the amount of information, people need to develop the critical thinking. They need to themselves understand and divide what is right, what is wrong, what is connecting to their values, and what actually is the external influence. Because currently, what we are struggling, if we are speaking about information, coming back to this topic, we're struggling with the consequences. So we're trying to eliminate the influence, the external influence from other countries that is evil. But a more sustainable solution for the future is to have the mental health programs, for example, the programs on critical thinking, when people are able to identify which are their ideas, which are the ideas that are being implemented, and emotions that are being caused by this, and are these ideas connecting to the values that people are having or not? So they also need to have these pillars that they can then navigate. So it's really very challenging in terms of the information wars. When we're speaking about interconnectedness and this ecological challenges, we probably currently with the war in Ukraine and also with COVID before, we're learning how to cooperate as countries, as those that are sharing the democratic values, those that are being able to manage these threats. This is also done with the help of technology, because when we are speaking about communication, when we are speaking about ability to come to visit different places, this is also tech. Like airplanes are also actually the technology that was created not that long ago, and that made our world a more connected place. And that actually poses an unprecedented group dynamic, country group dynamic. So now there are countries that are sharing the values, the democratic values, those that don't. And now there is some kind of a process launched where we need to learn that we should, as a community of countries, empower those with whom we share the same values, and do not empower those that are currently not sharing these values, but launch some other programs on just changing their opinions or something. So, for example, like when we are speaking that we are having some economic connections with those countries that are then threatening to attack our borders, that doesn't look like a sustainable strategy. So we need to learn how to do it different. And maybe these international institutions need also to be reconsidered. For example, United Nations. Like I think it is a shame that Russia is currently in the council there. Like while like it's. I think that when we are developing as a community of nations, it's all the time we need to rethink and revisit the strategies and rethink the structures that are being created so that they are new and they are able to respond to the threats that are up to date. Not the threats of the past, but the threats of the present and the future. And this is why we need to really be able to change, to constantly change. This is just general perspective on the tech. Just really, for me, it is also difficult to speak on this topic because it's huge, and I think that we still need to really think about this a little bit more on the bird's-eye view of these different processes and tendencies that are happening. And coming back to the topic tech for peace and tech for war, I just wanted to make a short comment why currently we're speaking about tech for peace while having war and using tech just to defeat ourselves. I believe that also humanitarian cultures and democratic world needs to be able to defend the values, because if we're also only humanistic and promoting the human values, but when we are attacked by countries that are not sharing these values, we need to be able to protect the world that we are building by showing to the aggressor that this is not the way how it should go. This is not the way how it will work for the future for that country or for any other country. And this is why defense tech is also part of the tech for peace, because it makes countries stronger. And we in Ukraine, coming back to my favorite topic, are creating the Brave One tech cluster and have around 400 innovations. 200 of them are already tested, and I think that we'd better exchange technology rather than human lives. So we're just like really better to launch drones or just to defend our territories by the help of technology than to risk the lives of the soldiers while we already are forced to have this war. So a little bit like mixed answer, just difficult question, but I hope that I gave the perspective. Yes.
Very much. Thank you, Natalie. And moving on to you, Jean. I mean, I should have said, but on top of you being the CEO of Connexio, you're also an ambassador for Tech for Good France, and I think the Mouvement Impact France as well. I guess, what is Tech for Peace to you? What does that mean? And you've got the minister sitting next to you, so what is the key policy priority that you encourage him to focus on when it comes to Tech for Peace? And perhaps one more thing I'd like you to respond to is one underlying theme that Natalie seems to have approached, if I'm not mistaken, is this idea of understanding what comes through tech channels and really this question of digital inclusion. How do we foster that in France, but also across the world when we face all the crises that we do?
So I would start with maybe the last part of the question, given I think one of the discussions we're having here is who are on the tech platforms, and I think one of the big things that we see at Connexio is making sure that we want to make sure everyone is still included, you know? There's people who are still considered digitally excluded today, either regarding a lack of access to, you know, the equipment, to the connectivity, and also a good mastery of the skills. And I think some of the things that concern us is that to be part of the ecosystem, to be able to benefit from all the innovations, we need to make sure individuals are included. So that's why we work heavily with partners like Google.org to make sure that we have the most reach possible. And if you just look at some of the statistics today, they're quite daunting. According to the UN, it's nearly 3.7 billion people who are considered to be part of the digital divide. So maybe we see it here in France and the US, but it's also quite a big problem in other countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, and other regions. And if you look at also where we're going in terms of the necessary skills to be part, in terms of economic inclusion also, that's very, very tied and increasingly tied to digital inclusion. We see that at least at the European level in the next few years, it's going to be about 1.2, at least globally, 1.2 billion jobs that are going to be impacted in Europe, and also in France. We see that more and more people are required to reskill or to upskill to stay relevant in the workforce. In France, we talk about the 13 million individuals who are considered digitally excluded, with 3/4 of jobs requiring basic digital skills. And so I think all these things are very important to keep in mind. But on the other hand, there's also a ton of different opportunities and potential available. We know that in the next few years, at the European level at least, if 10% of the workforce were to be upskilled in terms of mastery of digital skills, that's a benefit of about $45 billion to the economy. So I think there are huge benefits that we need to put, invest in the ecosystem. And so I think, the work obviously at Connexio, where we work now in France, in Africa, in the Middle East, we have a span of about nearly 20 cities, 40 sites, thousands of people we train per year. We have that reach to be able to see what are best practices also we can share with regard to this question of digital inclusion, how to make sure that people are part of the conversation, and how to also get them further along. And so maybe, to the question of, great to be on the same roundtable a few months later. We were together at a summit on impact a few months ago, and we had talked about a few of the key challenges when we talk about digital inclusion. I think there are two key issues that we want to address. One is to encourage, and I know that the French government has done a lot when it comes to digital inclusion. There is 250 million euros invested in digital inclusion and the Plan de Relance, with also 200 million invested in Conseil Numérique. So I think these are very important initiatives to make sure that throughout all the geographic territory in rural areas, for the most vulnerable populations, there's been measures done. I encourage a call to action to keep that focus on the digital divide, those who are most vulnerable, and also to think about what we're seeing is that we talk a lot about AI and all the new technologies and the training opportunities for the future. What we want to see is how can we bridge that gap a little bit more for those who are on more of the basic skills, and we can ensure that they have a more accessible possible path to these new opportunities. Right now we're seeing with the growth of new professions, new skills, that there's more of a difference, a gap, rather than a pathway. And so I think that's something we want to focus on. And the second piece of the, what I see is also to be able to build healthy economies, to be able to build healthy ecosystem. We know in France that the ecosystem of startups is growing, is building. We need to make sure that these teams that are being created are also inclusive when it comes to the talent that are in these teams. And I think something that we call for is also, to have more inclusive recruitment practices that can also be, pushed forward by different policies. So example, when we have students coming from Ukraine who are in our courses and who want to be a part of it, we don't have as many employers being very reticent because they're still concerned about different maybe stereotypes that are engendered by different different discrimination policies or other things. I think it's very important to focus on how do we bring more people in the pipeline to make sure they are already included? And then second, how do we continue to build different pathways so that for those who are wanting to go further, we can ensure a stable path for them?
Great. Thank you very much. Minister, turning to you, I'd like your take actually on this question of digital inclusions because it's so crucial to anything related to Tech for Peace. But more generally, how do you see governments and I guess public administrations and organizations, how do you see them working with the private tech sector, with NGOs to foster their work? Are there limitations to what the state can do? And I'd like to go back also to what Natalie was saying. Or should international organizations be reformed or changed for the purposes of making them more tech-oriented?
So yes, one of the byproduct of digital transformation is the digital divide, because digital transformation has downsides. And I think we are just at the beginning of measuring and seeing those downsides. In the next couple of years, this question of the digital divide will become more and more prevalent, as will be the cyber dimension of the digital transition. we are telling companies, organizations to accelerate on the digital transition because there is a lot to gain, of course. A lot of productivity gains to make out of it. But it also comes with the cost of higher cyber protection. And we need to find where the right trade-offs are. In particular, we need to address those costs, and we need to make sure that this digital transformation, which we think has more benefits than costs eventually, is successful. So when it comes to the digital divide, the latest figures that we have is that in France, 1 out of 3 people feel like they're digital remote, either because they are not connected, either because they don't feel they're skilled enough to browse or to access basic services. This is not a question of generations, because those that are digital remote are people with, without diplomas, with lower income, that are blue-collar rather than white-collar workers and so on. So it is a social fact, un fait social. To fight against this divide, what we've done 3 years ago, my predecessor, Cédrico, is to dedicate a big or a significant amount of public investments to hire digital counselors, 4,000 of them, that have been spread out across the country to bring counsel training to the people that are digitally remote. They've been hosted by local authorities, municipalities, associations, and so on. And it's been a great success, and we want to go further in this direction. And what we've built with all the stakeholders of this policy, which was so far dealt with at the national level, is a framework to have this policy governed at the local level, so that in every in every area in France, there is one leader of this policy that can coordinate the efforts of the private and the public sector in order to provide as much counsel as possible. So the first lever that we have in order to fight against the digital level is the human lever in some sense, and we want to activate it, of course. The second lever we have is on the other end of the spectrum, which is making tech more accessible. And here, that's what I was saying earlier, there is a lot that we can learn from Ukraine and from other democracies like India, for instance. As we've digitalized public services, because it was supposed to make access to public services simpler, what we've done is to increase inequality and the digital divide. Because our public access to public services was already complex before, and now you have the same stuff to do, but you have to go through a mouse, to a keyboard, and through complicated websites. In India, in Ukraine, digitalization of public services has been a lever for inclusion of hundreds of millions of people in accessing public services and rights. And what I think is that the new generation of technology, in particular AI and generative AI, can be the opportunity for all democracies and strong democracies like France to catch up on Ukraine, to catch up on India, and make sure that we simplify our processes and make them much more accessible than they used to be, because it will be possible in some years from now, once we have the tools and once they're robust, to access some of the services that are so complicated that 1/3 of our co-citizens do not access them today, through one very simple instrument, which is language. So I'm very hopeful that with the human level and with the technological level, we'll be able to bridge this digital gap.
And perhaps just a quick word on the relationship between public entities and private companies and NGOs. How does that work as an ecosystem, and what can be improved? You have a minute 20. Well, how can this be improved to further tech developments?
So we strongly believe that multi-stakeholder approach is the right approach, whether it comes to fighting disinformation, whether it comes to regulating generative AI, whether it comes to protecting children in the digital space. And President Macron has already launched several global multi-stakeholder initiatives, like the Christchurch Call, like the Paris Peace Forum, and like the Hiroshima process on generative AI, that basically try to put together around the table all the stakeholders. I'd like to give one very concrete example. Last year, on November 10th, was launched the Children Online Protection Lab, which is an initiative that brings together companies like Google, countries like Argentina, France, or Estonia, but also NGOs, in order to experiment new solutions to better protect children online. By deploying age verification, for instance, by fighting against cyberbullying. And so from year to year, those experimentation will occur, and then will be evaluated, and then we'll try to build on this experimentation. I think that's the right way to go.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. And please join me in thanking our 4 amazing panels. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to talk to us. Merci beaucoup d'être venus. Restez, puisque le prochain panel est tout aussi intéressant. Parlement européen de l'économie de demain. Et je vous remercie à toutes et tous d'être venus.